Hi, folks, and welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is produced by the Underserved Populations Training Project, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources, with funding from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Victim Services Branch, with funding made possible through the United States Department of Justice Victims of Crime Act. For those of you who can hear me, this probably seems obvious, but we just want to remind you to turn on your speakers in order to hear the presentation through your computer. Please note that there are two features to ask questions. You can use the Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you might have regarding content, which we encourage in this session. We will begin with questions that have been emailed in prior to the live session. If your question is not answered right away, please wait until the end of the presentation and we will ask it then. You may ask questions anonymously by checking the anonymous box in the Q&A feature. The chat panel is where you can ask me technical support questions if you're having issues with the webinar. We will answer those questions immediately in the chat panel. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce our trainer, Leanne Mull. She's a national speaker who has been working to prevent abuse and neglect of people with disabilities for 18 years. As an agency investigator in Illinois, she taught staff members how to recognize, report, and prevent abuse and neglect in this population. Additionally, Leanne has served as a team coordinator for the Illinois Imagines Project, coordinating response to victims with disabilities between rape crisis centers, agencies serving people with disabilities, and law enforcement. Currently, Leanne serves as the chair of the Responding with Victims with Disabilities Committee for the Illinois Family Violence Coordinating Council, a project of the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, the entity responsible for the creation and revision of protocols for law enforcement and prosecutors for responding to victims with disabilities and older adults. So without further ado, if you can give us 1 second, I will hand the reins over to Leanne and we will get started.
Okay, let me wait. And believe me, we practiced this, so.
Is that share screen button?
There it is. Yep,
Yeah.
I hit that, and let me do that, and let me get up here.
Perfect.
To slideshow, and hello, good morning. Good morning to California. It's a little bit later here in Illinois, but I want to get started. We're going to get started with an overview of different disability types that you may encounter people who have one or more of these. And what we're going to be talking about is intellectual and developmental disabilities, people on the autism spectrum, people with mental illness, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, people who are deaf or people who are low vision or blind. And then there are other invisible disabilities. A lot of times you may be assisting or working with someone with a disability who you may not realize has a disability, and it's okay to ask. I don't say, "Oh, what's your disability?" But some of the questions that I have learned, especially for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, some questions you can ask is, how can I help you? Are there any accommodations that you need? One of the most helpful questions, and this is for people who may have intellectual disability that is not particularly severe, but you get a sense that they may need assistance. I'll ask people, how old were you when you graduated from high school? Because typically people with intellectual disabilities graduate when they're 21 rather than 18. I will ask them if they ever had classes in small groups. And so questions like that can give you an idea of the person who you're working with and what they may need. When you're talking to practitioners or people who work in the disability field and you hear dual diagnosis, that is I know elsewhere it is a dual diagnosis is some sort of substance abuse with perhaps mental illness. A dual diagnosis in the disability world is two different types of disability, typically intellectual disabilities along with mental illness. And that is becoming more and more common as we learn more about working with people. Some of the things that people with disabilities, when we talk to them, have told us, a disability does not mean an inability. Each of us have strengths and weaknesses and areas in which we need support. Because someone has any disability does not mean that they need assistance in all areas. So as you are working with people in whatever your role is, realize that the person, what people with autism say is, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. If you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. People say, I'm a person. I'm a person first, before my disability. People with disabilities are more alike people without disabilities than they are different. And because someone has a label, regardless of, one of the things I could have put up that, said a label is for a soup can. Each person that you're working with, regardless of disability, is that unique person with that unique person's history and experiences. This goes along with it, and what I was about to say too is, typically people with disabilities experience trauma at 2 to 3 times the rate of people without disabilities. If you add to that the fact that a person who identifies as LGBTQ has that same factor, 2 to 3 times more likely to experience violence. In school, we call it bullying. Out of school, violence. However you want to define it, it leads to trauma. And so you add the 2 to 3 times for a person with a disability, add to that the 2 to 3 times for the person who identifies as LGBTQ, and you are off the charts in the prevalence and in the experience of the people and how that impacts what they can do and how they process through what's happening to them. Differences in ability is ordinary. What I am not good, I would rather speak to 500 people than have small talk with 3 people who I don't know. And there are other people who are like, I could never get up and speak in a group. We all have, when I was a case manager for people with disabilities, I'm terrible at paperwork. But I loved being a case manager because I liked to hang out with the people. I did the paperwork because I had to. But there are case managers who are phenomenal at that. And so we all, whether we have a disability or not, have differences in what we're able to do and what we are good at. People with disabilities experience violence at alarming rates. There is, I don't think this is in the resources that are on this slide deck, but there was recently, about 4 months ago, National Public Radio did a series on violence against people specifically with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And there are estimates that between 87 and 93% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have experienced some form of abuse. That can be physical abuse, mental abuse. People with a less significant disability who live on their own are more likely to experience financial exploitation or some other sexual exploitation. Women with disabilities are, I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think it's at least 3 times more likely to be victims of human trafficking than people without disabilities. And this goes to sex trafficking, slave labor, particularly the last thing that I read, that if you want these, if you, my contact information is at the end. And I don't have the article with me, but people, the traffickers prefer women who are deaf because it's less likely that they will be able to communicate what is happening to them. And the NPR series, the author is Joe Shapiro. You can Google it and listen to this. Listen to the prevalence and the stories and the lack of justice for the victims. One of the women interviewed is from California, and the abuse of her sister occurred in one of the institutions in California, which brings us to there's no federal crime data except that hate crimes, if there's any prosecutors on the call, people with disabilities fall under the hate crimes statute. And I'm pretty sure that is the case in California too. I'm 99% sure that that is the case in California too, that you can get enhancements to charges if the person has a disability. Here, see, I went ahead of myself, but the 3 to 10 times more likely to experience violence than people without disabilities. And this was the slide that I wanted to get to. 97% of the time, the person who is doing the abusing and the exploiting and the violence is someone who is known to the person and trusted by the victim or the family. Most often, it's people paid to provide services, family members, transportation providers, because once they have them in that vehicle, they have them in that vehicle. There was a case in Canada where a woman who was a happy, liked her life, liked going to her day program, lived with mom and dad, used to, for years and years and years, she would wait at the window waiting for the van to come and pick her up. And then all of a sudden everything changed. She didn't want to go to her day program anymore. She didn't want to get on the van. They hired a behavior analyst, which is what happens a lot of time with people with disabilities. When they have a behavior change, the first line of defense is they need medication. They need some sort of psychotropic medication. And this woman who had been an easygoing, loved by everyone, all of a sudden when she did get to day program, was crying, was hitting other people in an effort to escape the day program. And thankfully, the organization, rather than insist on her seeing a psychiatrist to receive some psychotropic medication, hired a behavior analyst, and he went did his job and followed her on the van, trying to figure out what's happening. Are there people on the van who she doesn't know? It was a public transportation, like a door-to-door public transportation, and it turned out that the new van driver was dropping everyone off and then taking her to a remote park and was raping her on a regular basis. And thankfully they found this out, but this is typical for people with disabilities, particularly people who are more involved, need more support, because they're not usually with people who they don't know. What some survivors have said, no one would believe me because they could not imagine anyone sexually assaulting someone like me. Currently, as part of the Illinois Family Violence Coordinating Council, we're revising protocols for prosecutors. We already have protocols for law enforcement that, it's 250 pages of ways to assist law enforcement to help people with disabilities, including handouts and anything that you would want to share with law enforcement. But we've recently started with prosecutors, and one of the biggest barriers, we've interviewed some prosecutors and we're trying to deal with this in these protocols, is that juries have a hard time believing that anyone would hurt someone with a disability. That's the upside. The other side is not understanding that the sexual assault is power-based, not arousal-based, or however you want to say it. They look at someone with a disability as, well, who in the world would ever want to attack her? So that is a huge barrier. One woman said the detective knew I was upset. She took me to the scene and I showed her what happened. She was great, and the man was in prison. Third, I waited for hours in the emergency room because they didn't know how to get me on the table. Included in this, at the end of this, are some resources, and one of those is a resource to help. It's a picture guide for sexual assault exams, and some ideas, first of all, to show the woman with a disability what is going to happen. But it also includes training for the SANEs on how to help the person. And one of the keys is ask them what to do. Not every woman can get in the stirrups. They know the best way to help them. Some unique dynamics of abuse of people with disabilities: grooming. Just like there's grooming for children, everything you know about grooming for children can happen for people with disabilities, physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities. In intellectual disabilities, it goes a step further to the grooming of the family members. Of course, don't worry. Go ahead, go out on a date. Because a lot of times when you have adults with disabilities living with their families, mom and dad, a lot of times run their lives, but but for mom and dad, their whole lives revolve around the child. And so when they have someone who has ingratiated themselves with the family, the same thing can happen when we're talking about children. Taking advantage of lack of sexual education or knowledge. Typically, and we are actively trying to change this, but typically children with disabilities are not included in sex education at the schools. If you have a program, I'm not sure, in hindsight, I would have done a survey of who was here, but in Illinois, the rape crisis centers have curriculum. They go in and talk to kids at the schools. And what we realized in talking to those rape crisis center educators is that the kids with disabilities are not being included. And so we've actually gone in and adapted some of the materials to be used with the people, but this is also true for adults. Here in Illinois, we're in the middle of hearings trying to require organizations to have sex education for the people who live in group homes. And the people fighting it the hardest are parents who say, not my child. It's not going to happen to my child. If you were in any of the classes that I taught out there, and I say this in every class, there's a Law and Order Special Victims Unit episode. It's season 3, episode 22, and it is about a woman with Down syndrome who gets pregnant. She had never had sex education. They blamed it on the boyfriend. It wasn't the boyfriend. I'll blow the ending for you, but it was her boss in the community taking advantage of the fact that she did not know anything about sex. And so as you're talking to people, they may not know what happened to them. They may not know what to call it. I encourage you to watch that episode because it hits on every point. It hits on the overprotection by the parents. It hits on the fact that people, just like pedophiles, it's like they have a radar on who they can take advantage of and who's going to tell and who is getting no support from anyone else who's not paid to give support and gets no love and affection, and that is what and that's who they'll go after. Another thing to watch for is withholding or destroying adaptive equipment. If the person has a physical disability, is the caregiver, is their walker, is their wheelchair, can they get to things? Can they get to the phone? Women with physical disabilities who have talked about getting away from their abuser, one of the reasons that it was so hard is they have no way of reaching out to other people. They have no access to the phone. If the person who they are living with who is abusing them takes the phone with them, puts the phone out of reach. Some more observable behavior, they may treat the victim like a child. They may try to speak for the victim. That's where we come in saying, no, you can wait outside. Or, typically I do not give the, I'll say, we're just going to talk, just the two of us, you can wait outside. If you ask, depending on the person, do you want this person to stay? It's just like any other person who's been abused, who you're dealing with. They are living in fear of this person, and you don't know if that's the person who's abusing them. They may control everything, limit access to phone, limit access to wheelchairs, walkers, and of course they're charming to us. They're charming to us. One thing I want to hit on in the disability world, especially people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they have been trained to comply with everything that a staff person says, that a family member says. If you live in 24-hour services, everyone is your boss. Okay, you have no say in your life. You have a bedtime. You are told when you're going to eat. You are told what you're going to eat. If you don't want to eat what's for dinner, you may or may not be able to make a sandwich. Okay, so they are taught to comply, which is, we train, I work in disability services, we train people to be the perfect victim. And that is something that I'm working on, with my other hat, is training people with disabilities that, yes, you can speak up for yourself, you can have opinions, but know as you are interviewing that they have been trained to comply. One of the best things and easiest things that you can do when you're interviewing someone is allowing them to choose where to sit. That is going to set the tone. Now, keep in mind, they may not know, they may not be able to make that decision, which is going to speak volumes as to what their level of compliance. But you are setting the tone so that they can understand, you know what, I'm going to listen to you. Some other risk factors: limited ability to escape, or they don't know what, they don't know how to escape or what's out there. One of the things, the best victim in disability services is someone who has a mental illness and an intellectual disability, because people typically, staff, don't listen to them. So who's the perfect person to abuse? The person who has a reputation as the boy who cried wolf. Because then when something happens, no one believes them. As we're talking about people, talking a little bit about the least dangerous assumption is that all people can communicate. I'm looking at the clock and running out of time here, but on a further slide we have we're talking about different ways to communicate with people and what that can mean, and what it can mean in court. There are some precedent cases where people were allowed to, one man was allowed to answer questions by tapping a pencil. Okay, so it can be done. Criminal cases can be won by people. So one of the things that we have seen happen in agencies like rape crisis centers, even prosecutor offices, even Law and Order Special Victims Unit, they have special victims, and victims with disabilities fall in there. And so one model that was for a while what everyone thought was best practices is disability competence. I need to be competent and knowledgeable about all types of disabilities and accommodations and legal definitions before I can work with people with disabilities. The problem with that model is, if at your agency, and kudos to you, if people have been, kudos to everybody on this call and your organizations for realizing that supporting victims with disabilities is important. But what happens then is, what happens when you're not there? What we don't want is everyone else to be afraid to work with a person with a disability because they haven't had training. And so when we're talking about disability humility, I just love this. When I meet someone with disability, I will be open, creative, respectful, and ready to learn. I will treat everyone with a disability as a unique person, just like you would any other person, whether they had a disability or not. One of the best things that you can ask yourself is, what do I need that I don't have. And we're probably going to end up closing with this after this for questions, but we had a case here where the detective did a great job interviewing the person, but was concerned that he did not have enough information. And so one of the people who knew the woman who was helping with things asked, what do you need that you don't have? And what he said was, I don't even know where this happened. She can't tell me where this happened. She knew it was a park, but she had no idea what park it was, and there were several parks in this town. And so the suggestion was, well, can we take her around to the different parks? The detective said, oh, well, okay, we can do that. They drove her around. There was, whatever, 8, 10 parks in the town. Drove her to the parks. When they got to the park where she had been assaulted, she was able to tell them this was the park. They were able to nail down the time of day that it happened. So they did a canvass, and turns out the neighbors had noticed, or the people who lived around this park had noticed, that there was a sketchy car there that they did not recognize. And they were able to find the guy, find out that he is a serial rapist, and he is in prison now. Because of that question, what do you need that you do not have? And that's where you can ask that question to law enforcement. You can ask that question to yourself to figure out a way to get justice for the person. And so we said we were going to stop at 12:30, Allie. I'm not sure for questions. I'm not sure if we have enough or if I should keep going.
If you have a couple more slides of content, let's cover those, and then we'll
Okay.
cover questions when we're done.
All right, perfect. So basic considerations, and you guys will have, I'm sure there'll be a recording of this. Communicate with adults as adults. And that does not mean use $10 words. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, oh, honey, it's going to be okay. Let me help you. Check your tone of voice. They're adults. They may be an adult with a disability, but they're still adults. Don't touch wheelchairs or other equipment unless you have permission. People's equipment is the same as personal space. That equipment is included in their personal space. Use plain language. Use language that people will understand, and assume, just like if I'm walking into court, there's nothing that says that I'm going to understand everything that's happening. And I don't have a disability. So we need to explain what people may or may not know and watch the jargon. We all have, we call it alphabet soup, everything that you can think of. We all have a bunch of different acronyms that we use for everything. So when we're talking about accommodations, the best thing to do is to work on it before you have a client come in who has a disability. Have materials available in large print. There is I don't know if you guys have ever heard of universal design, but the theory behind universal design is if we design for people with disabilities, it's good for everybody. Okay, if we design brochures with larger print, it's easier for everybody to read, easier for older adults, easier for people who, I don't know about anybody else, but I like it way better if I can see what I'm looking at. Have a list of American Sign Language interpreters. There is a website that can give you a list by county in California. One woman said, I feel most welcome when accommodations are not a big deal. Look around your office. Could a person with a wheelchair get in there? Do you have chairs without arms? What if you have an oversized, a person who is oversized? Would they have somewhere to sit? At Midway Airport in Chicago, there is nowhere to sit in the food court, nowhere to sit at a table that doesn't have arms. And I was working with a man with disability who he couldn't fit in any of the chairs. And so look around your office. Are there chairs where people who are large people can sit comfortably? Do you have chairs with arms? If someone has a seizure disorder, they may require a chair with arms. Ask the person what they need. They know the best. Here's some of the accommodations in court. Victim allowed to answer yes or no, tap the pencil. One victim was allowed to use gesture and pantomime. Another victim was allowed to testify with her support dog with her. And the defense fought that tooth and nail because they said they're going to vote. They're going to vote. They're going to charge him because they like the dog. Okay, so form partnerships ahead of time. Law Enforcement Rape Crisis Center. In California, there are regional centers for people with disabilities. Connect with them. On the Illinois Imagines website, which is going to be, the information is on this slide deck. On the Illinois Imagines website, there's a toolkit that is for rape crisis centers, for disability service agencies, for mental health centers, and for law enforcement on how you can work together to provide supports and best support people. So the rest of the slides, I think, are resources. So if there's questions, we can do that now.
Great. So feel free, folks, to send in your questions. I'm just going to ask them in the order that I received them. So the first question says, can you explain the evolution away from the Asperger's diagnosis?
Yes. So as the prevalence of autism has increased, okay, exponentially increased, there are a lot of different theories behind why. But what's been happening is they changed the definition, the medical definition, into where it used to be autism or Asperger's. Now it is all under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And so within that spectrum, people with Asperger's, many of them prefer to be called high-functioning autistics. And so really it was a name change. It's the same. Asperger's is now known as high-functioning autism. There is an organizing group, an advocacy group called ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, that is run by people with high-functioning autism. You can get a wealth of information there. Their political platform, and what they want as people with autism. So it's the same disability, different name.
Great, thank you. The next question is about people with disabilities and consent and how it's determined who can legally provide consent and who can't.
So this is a big thing, and this is a statewide, this is a lot of times a state issue. It depends on your state, the scope of guardianship. So if someone has a legal guardian, the bottom line definition of guardianship is the guardian is to make the decision that the person would make were they able to make it. So in some states, like Illinois, guardianship does not extend to sexual partners. It does extend to covering marriage, but there are tests that are used really in the courts to determine whether someone can give consent. We just had a case here in Illinois that was upheld, and this was like 2 weeks ago, that was upheld, that they were able to prove that the perpetrator knew that the woman who he attacked, he tried to say that she gave consent, and they were able to prove that he knew she couldn't give consent by her behavior and by his, he was a family friend. But a lot of times, and I know I'm going around this, we could talk for hours about consent, but there are a lot of states have tests, California is one of them, to determine whether someone has the capacity to consent. And so it's different in courts. One of the things that happens, I was talking to somebody in California about this, and one of the things that happens is people are so afraid, or organizations, support organizations are so afraid of erring on the side of, well, we allowed this when they shouldn't have been able to consent, that they won't let people date. They don't want people to hold hands and hug. And so it's making its way through the courts and legislature to try to figure out how to determine consent. So that's not a perfect answer. I wish I had. I wish I could say this is what it is, but really it is a case by case basis. And this case in Illinois, went all the way to the Court of Appeals, and they upheld the conviction because they were able to prove that, the woman was in special ed. And this was not a guy who was in special ed with her. This was a family friend, 30 years older than her. But they were able to prove what she could, her decision-making capacity in school, and then as in a young adult in services, and we're able to say that she could not consent to this.
Thank you. So we have two similar questions about kind of two different categories of people. One question is about people with disabilities who identify as LGBTQ, and another is about people with disabilities and substance abuse. And both questions are asking if there's any research or considerations that service providers should make for those people.
Yes, there are. So more and more recently, like in the last 2 years, there are a lot more people with who identify as LGBTQ, who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, who are coming out as LGBTQ, and organizations, but this is recent and it's few and far between. And so organizations not working with people with disabilities need to be aware that typically they're not supported in this decision. There is no I have an article about this that I don't have in front of me, but it was the prevalence of men who with disabilities have had no education around safe sex, do not know anything about it, or that it's even there's just no awareness of safe sex whatsoever. They are shamed and not supported, particularly if they are in full life service. Now, that is people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. People with physical disabilities, it's the same consideration that you would give any person who identifies as LGBTQ. They come out at the same levels. The difference is when there's an intellectual disability and there's no support for that. As far as substance abuse goes, my understanding is the levels, the statistics. You know what? I know there's research out there. I just don't have it in front of me. And so I don't want to answer wrong, but my contact information is there. If you email me, I can do the research and find it, because I know it's like floating out in my head somewhere, and I don't have it in front of me.
That's perfect. That's okay. Thank you. Can you touch on the topic of people with sensory processing disorders and how we can best serve clients with those needs?
Do they mean, or do you mean people who are blind or deaf, or do you mean like people with autism who may have like light sensitivity? Because those are different. If we're talking about people with autism, then we're talking about fluorescent lights. Typically people, and again, you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, but a lot of times people with autism can hear the fluorescent lights going, or that gentle flashing will bother people. So what I can tell you is ask the person. A lot of times people don't like to be touched, particularly by people they don't know. They have sensitivity to rough, the reason none of us have tags in our t-shirts anymore is because Michael Jordan was sensitive to that physically, and so Haynes developed those for Michael Jordan. And so it's that awareness, a general awareness of, do we need the lights off? Are the lights going to bother people? Are loud noises going to bother people? Should we have music going softly? What's going to help the person? If the person can't tell you, then typically they're going to have a caregiver with them who may be able to tell you how they are more comfortable. For people who are, if we're talking about people who are deaf and blind, people who are blind, the Lighthouse for the Blind, which is a national, there's a huge one here in Chicago, can help with resources around that. And the Centers for Independent Living can help with, they work with people who are blind or low vision. They work with people who are deaf or hard of hearing. They have resources and information. And it goes back to ask the person what's going to make them more comfortable.
Great, thank you. The next question is, do you have any tips on how to identify people with disabilities that might be experiencing abuse, like things we might look for?
Yes. Unexplained bruise. So let's talk about physical abuse first. Unexplained bruises in weird places. One of the most prevalent ones is a bruise of a thumb and forefingers on the upper arm, because that is a good grab spot for abusers. People who have like a fear reflex, if you speak loudly, if you come near them, a flinch, if you come near them. Unexplained crying, unexplained anger, fear of a specific person, fear of I want to say weird staff behavior. There was a case where a person had been, like when you spin a towel and flick it at somebody when you're a kid at the pool. this person had been abused in the past, and unfortunately, what I'm telling you is very prevalent, had been abused in the past, and the staff knew that, and so the agency couldn't figure out why this guy would listen to this staff person when he wouldn't listen to anybody else. And then they saw when he would tell the guy to do something, he'd be holding a dish towel and spinning it so that the guy could see it. And that happens a lot. So it's watching caregiver behavior, you know, what we listed, treating the person like a child, speaking for the person, looks at the person. I'm sure you guys have seen the withering looks. Financial exploitation. If you have a person who doesn't have money when they should have money, they have hanger-on friends. Do they not have food in their house? Is their food all gone and they have no money to purchase more food? That happens a lot with people with mental illness and with a mild intellectual disability. I used to train people to work in the community, and I would talk to them about not loaning money to people, and we would work on this and work on this and work on this, and then a few hours later I would go up and say, hey, do you have a dollar so I can get a can of pop? And they'd say, sure, Leanne. Okay, because everybody is their friend. And so that's, I think I hit exploitation, physical disabilities, and emotional disabilities. Is the caregiver yell? Yelling is abuse, and yelling is abuse for people with disabilities, the same as it's abuse for anybody else. Watch the tone of voice of the caregivers and or if they're a staff person or family members.
Great. And this next question actually kind of piggybacks on that one. We're asking about tips or tricks to best communicate with the parents or guardians of a victim with disabilities who might be very protective or private.
My first question would be, the first thing you need to know, are you absolutely positive that the parent or family member is not the perpetrator? If you're absolutely, in a case of stranger rape, our job is to speak for the victim. So one thing I ask guardians and parents is, what would your life look the same if mom and dad were still making all of your decisions for you? And a lot of times the light bulb will go off. Okay. The best thing that you can do is help them to understand that their child needs this, needs closure, needs counseling. There's no reason why a parent should not want their kid to have counseling unless they're afraid of what the kid is going to say. And I'm not trying to make all parents out to be bad. And they love, just like our parents love us, and are overprotective of us, but it's getting through. If the victim cannot communicate what they want, do they want to participate in this? In Illinois, the guardians, there's a new law that the guardians cannot, neither can they insist on a sexual assault exam, nor can they deny it. Either one. It's up to the person. And if the person indicates that they do not want to participate, that is respected whether or not the guardians want it or not. And so if you email me, I can send you that legislation so that you can replicate that in California, because I don't think it's out there already. But the first thing I said about think about your life, would it be different? That seems to, there hasn't been a time when they haven't responded to that, I should say, and realized, oh, okay, we need to do this. But I've had women survivors who, they had no closure, and this is 10 years ago, and they're still talking about it. The guy went to jail, but he pled guilty, but they really it wasn't explained to them. And so explaining to mom and dad that whether it seems like the person can understand or not, we still need to let them know what's going on. We still need to ask them. When you're talking with mom and dad in the room, you're still talking to the person. Whether mom and dad are answering, I wish I could mom and dad may be talking over here, but you should be looking at the person and asking the person, because what that does is tell mom and dad, I'm working for the person. I'm not working for you. I don't know if that helped or not.
It certainly did.
I could talk about this stuff for hours. So.
Sure. So I think we have time for one last question. And this question is coming from a mental health provider. And they are asking if you can provide more specific detail on how to work with people with disabilities during mental health treatment after a sexual assault or domestic violence incident. And what are the interactions between disabilities and domestic violence?
Okay, so on the end of this, if you go to the Illinois Department of Human Services website, we're part of End Violence Against Women Envision. It's called Envision Illinois, and it's resources for women with disabilities and who are deaf, who experience domestic violence. And people with, first of all, the rape crisis centers provide counseling, and anyone who has been a victim, whether they have a disability or not, is entitled to that counseling. This isn't what used to happen in Illinois is, the case manager with a bachelor's degree is trying to deal with this. You have to involve professionals, whether they have a disability or not, because we don't want to make things worse. And that's where, if you're the mental health provider, get the Illinois Imagines toolkit from the website, and you can read how to connect ahead of time with the Rape Crisis Center. They are, this is their whole job. So I don't try to, I would never try to counsel someone after a sexual assault. That is not my my counseling would be, we need to talk to a professional, because I've been asked before by people, and what I do is connect them. And so as an organization, the best thing you can do is connect with your Rape Crisis Center and find out what services they offer before you need the services, because you will need the services. And then after that, they can guide you. There's a campaign called Start by Believing. I don't know if you guys know about that, but if you Google Start by Believing, that also has resources. And because that's our job. My job is not to try to figure out if they're telling the truth. My job is to start by believing what they are saying happened to them and go from there.
Perfect. Thank you. Can I have you, Leanne, progress your slides forward to the one with your contact info, so folks, while they're still on here, can see that? Thank you so much. So I want to, of course, thank you, Leanne, for your expertise and for being available this morning to answer folks' questions live. I want to thank all of our attendees for sending in their questions and being here. Everyone who joined the webinar should have a browser redirect of an evaluation, which we would love to have, if you could fill that out. And I'll leave the screen up for just a couple more minutes so people can write down your website and email address, but I want to thank you very much all for being here, and have a great rest of your day.
And on the Blue Tower Solutions, there's links to Illinois Imagine. So if you go to that, you can link to everything we talked about, or just email me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Give me a day, and if I don't get back, please hit me again.
Perfect, thank you. And someone's asking if they missed an opportunity to get the slides. We haven't sent out your slides, but with your permission, we can and will send them to the folks who attended.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Perfect. So we will do that after the webinar is over.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for attending.
Are we done?
We're done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you do.